big cities are magnets for people looking for better opportunities, but finding an affordable place to live close to work is getting harder. And in South America's biggest city, inadequate housing is finding its way into the ballot box.
This issue was absolutely propelled into the forefront of the political debate in this October's municipal election. The lack of low-cost, good quality housing is an issue here in Sao Paulo, and politicians cannot ignore it. My name is Elizabeth Johnson. I am the director of Brazil research for TS Lombard, which is part of Global Data. I basically cover all things that are related to Brazilian economic policy and economic growth.
Elizabeth Johnson is also the author of an article on Sao Paulo's housing efforts in the December issue of Finance and Development magazine. Journalist Rhoda Metcalf caught up with her to find out more about the city's innovative approach.
You know, when we think about new low-cost housing projects, we generally expect them to be built, out in the suburbs or perhaps on some less sought-after pieces of land. But in Sao Paulo, some of the newest housing projects are actually happening right downtown. So why there?
The downtown area, which is arguably one of the most attractive in terms of architecture and has interesting cultural spaces, but it had been slowly abandoned as the financial centers moved away from the downtown area, and it really left a void. And about 20% of the buildings in the downtown area are currently vacant.
Okay.
And a lot of those buildings are owned by the federal government.
Oh, right.
They are either part of the federal court system or in some cases the Social Security Agency or other agencies that have closed and moved or had too many properties. And there's now this approach to these empty properties and see them as a part of the solution rather than the problem.
Right. So are there actually efforts now to renovate these buildings and have people move in? I mean, is that happening?
Yes. So in the article, we spoke to Dona Marli, who is a housing activist, and she's somebody who was living in substandard housing with her husband in a neighborhood that's far from the city center. Her husband was spending hours commuting each day, and she became involved with a social movement that works to get affordable housing for the population.
Right.
And this movement occupied a building in downtown Sao Paulo, and thanks to the federal government's low-income housing program called Minha Casa Minha Vida, the movement was able to get financing from the federal government to renovate the building for the families who participated in that social movement.
Right.
And what really struck me visiting Dona Marli's house is simply how anyone walking by the building would have no idea that this wasn't just a middle-class building in the downtown area.
Really?
The sense of community is very strong. The maintenance is impeccable, and everyone truly feels a sense of ownership for that property.
Right. I mean, that's one project. Have there been a number of projects like that downtown?
So clearly the municipal government understood the success of these programs through the federal government. And the current finance minister Fernando Haddad was the mayor of Sao Paulo. And during that period, there were intense debates about the future of the city planning. So
Right.
during his period as mayor, they passed the master city plan. And one of the provisions in the plan was a progressive property tax. So any building that is unoccupied, and they could see that it was unoccupied because it had no electric or water consumption, would slowly get a progressively higher property tax.
Okay.
Eventually, if the property taxes went unpaid and the building remained unoccupied, then it created the opportunity for the city to negotiate with the property owners and say, look, you owe us back property taxes. You're not developing this place. Shall we try and find a solution to these empty properties?
Interesting.
And that's exactly what we had in June. The first round of buildings were expropriated by the city. It didn't even involve any lawyers. So basically, the property owners agreed to sell the properties to the city.
Minus the taxes.
Minus the taxes. And so we'll see another round of development for those properties. There are around a dozen other federal buildings that have been occupied that have applied for the Minha Casa Minha Vida funding.
So all of this is quite a contrast from the early low-income housing projects in Sao Paulo. I mean, because they were located way out in the outskirts of the city, right? I mean, those first projects, I understand, taught some very important lessons. Can you tell me about that?
So many of the original projects ended up being located in places that became very difficult for people to live.
Right.
So you would expect the standard of living of a family to go up when they are given a free house.
Sure.
But in fact, depending on the location of the house, it could ultimately end up hurting the family and the heads of households opportunities to work in the formal sector and to get off of the social benefits. So about half of the people who were given a free housing unit decided not to accept it because they didn't want to move hours away from their jobs to these new areas of town that didn't have the same job opportunities,
Sure.
that didn't have the same retail infrastructure. So there's been a lot of debate about trying to build the units in places that are closer to public transport, to existing infrastructure.
Sure.
And that's definitely the case for the units that are targeting lower middle class families rather than the poorest families.
Okay.
But for the poorest families, it's still a challenge because of the cost of acquiring land close to jobs, to transport, which is where everybody wants to live.
Yeah, and I assume that these downtown projects, I mean, they're super interesting, but I mean, there's not going to be enough of them to solve this huge housing gap. So what other kinds of solutions are they coming up with? You know, higher apartment buildings or...
Well, Sao Paulo has definitely moved in general toward allowing higher buildings in areas that are located close to public transport.
Right.
So that is definitely the trend. And as more metro lines, more train lines, more bus lanes are built, which is something that all politicians want in Brazil. And here in Sao Paulo, it's slow, but they've been successful at expanding transport infrastructure.
Okay.
You know, that's made it more viable for people to live in more distant locations.
Right.
And we've seen a lot of NGOs that are working to help families access microcredit for small renovations that improve the quality of their homes.
Right.
They argue that actually, instead of building new projects and, tearing down what exists and building these massive new projects, that actually the real focus should be on substandard housing that exists and just making small improvements in infrastructure. So
the current stock and making it better.
Make it better. And that the cost of that is much lower.
Right.
But from a political perspective, it doesn't necessarily allow for that ribbon-cutting ceremony where all the politicians want to come and show that they've given the new housing unit to the families.
So you mentioned in talking about the building projects downtown that you spoke to a housing activist who was very involved with that, with making that project happen. And I understand that there's really a long history of social movements in Brazil who do these kinds of organized takeovers of buildings, right?
Yes, there definitely been important figure in cities in terms of pushing for a debate about widespread access to low-cost housing.
Right.
These movements, there are dozens of them. The idea is that if there's an empty building, then the social movement organizes a invasion to squat in the building.
Okay.
When it's a federal building that's unoccupied for many years, usually there's not that much pushback.
Right.
But in some cases, these unoccupied buildings are owned by the private sector or private citizens, and then the police can get involved.
Right.
So
it's been pretty common to have these kinds of squatting in buildings for long stretches of time in Sao Paulo.
Yes, particularly as the center became less occupied, the number of squats, of occupations increased.
You mentioned also in your article that the social movements, these social activists, are playing a pretty active role in organizing, even designing these new housing projects. So how does that work? Marlee talked to us about how prior to moving in, the members of the social movement worked together to just to get people prepared for what to expect in terms of, noise, in terms of maintenance, in terms of costs. Sure.
And in the Dandara building, where it was owned by the Federal Labor Court. And so, this was not a cookie-cutter building that could have, 24 one-bedroom apartments and, 24 studios and then some two-bedrooms. So everything had to be adapted to the existing structure. So even that in and of itself involved debate because everybody was given a different size unit based on their needs.
Right.
The building has space for a library, and that was a decision that they made together. Okay. It also has a room for social gatherings, which can be used also for political meetings or for parties.
All right.
Brazilians love birthday parties, so this is the birthday party room. So the use of those shared spaces, it's all discussed among the residents.
That's interesting. Do you think that with a lot of tension on trying to fill these empty buildings in the city center, that it will change the city to a certain extent, especially its downtown core?
Well, that's the goal. The city center had a tough period during COVID.
Yeah.
It really became very deserted, and it struggled to come back. But now we are seeing more restaurants, more bars. It's attracting kind of the younger hipster crowd because of its current affordability in terms of housing. The state government, the city government, everybody is increasingly more invested in getting the city center back on its feet.
Sure.
The problem is, like many global cities, it still has issues with crime that need to be addressed.
I'm sure.
I would say there's definitely been a cultural renaissance in the city where people are heading to restaurants in the downtown area. One restaurant that received a Michelin star that's in the downtown that has, long lines every day. But when I went there, I said, oh, well, I'll sit on the sidewalk rather than wait, because they do have sidewalk seating. And they were like, okay, but, leave your phone inside. Don't take your phone out. So even in this, very well-traffic area, people would still feel quite insecure in terms of the possibility of getting robbed. So that's... security remains one of the more challenging issues of the region, particularly post-COVID.
Yeah, it's not an easy process. Well, this has been great. Thank you, Elizabeth Johnson. I really appreciate learning more about the housing situation in Sao Paulo and enjoyed having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Elizabeth Johnson is the Director of Brazil Research at TS Lombard. She was speaking with Rhoda Metcalf. Look for her article in the December issue of Finance and Development magazine at imf.org/FND. And go to imf.org/podcasts to find more of these podcasts and sign up to our weekly newsletter. Our handle on X is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalf. Thanks for listening.